is a look at sort of the issue of political economy. And I'm going to phrase it in terms of John Maynard Keynes and Friedrich Hayek, the two sort of primary economic theorists of the 20th century who helped to frame our understanding of the debate over the role of government and the role of free markets and the extent to which government should be involved. And remember, when we're talking about economics and ideology, we're talking about a matter of degree, not either or, but actually a matter of how much. That's really important. Economic theories, as you saw if you looked at the chart of sort of ideological thinkers or philosophical thinkers, and how they come from Adam Smith in the West, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau even comes a little bit from Smith. You understand that economics is an important element to the way we understand politics. It used to be that politics helped to frame economics, but as I'm going to argue here, economics increasingly is becoming the primary calculator. And Naomi Klein, I'm sorry, Ethel Klein's a political scientist, I know. Naomi Klein actually argued that neoliberal economics has sort of taken over the right of people to determine their own lives. And we're going to talk about that again in greater detail after Christmas. So economic theory is almost always an ideology. And to remind you what I mean by that is we have to remember an ideology is the normative assumption about what the ideal world should look like, a diagnosis of the current state of affairs and how it doesn't conform to that idea, and then a specific set of steps to get there. So economics, like politics, can be studied sort of as the study of an ideology about the normative beliefs, but also about some of the behavioral details. So like politics, it can be studied either qualitatively or quantitatively. Economics, macroeconomics is what I'm talking about. Microeconomics is about the nuts and bolts. So microeconomics really delves into the empirical assessments of systems and little pieces of that system. Macroeconomics looks at the systems as a whole. And so that's where we're going to be today. So capitalism, sort of the economic system, much of the world, almost all the world, but not all the world, sort of follows, is the economic expression of classical liberalism. And just, in case you didn't get this out of Roskin, classical liberalism believes that there's this natural law. While economics says there's this natural law of economics, it's experiential, not divine. Now, the difference between experiential and divine, experiential means the trial and error of 10,000 years or so of human history. Divine, of course, would mean comes from a deity, God, or some other natural force, or supernatural force, I'm sorry. Economics tends to focus on natural law as being sort of empirical and experiential. So all of these theories come from the practice of humans exchanging goods and services and having relationships. So that's the first thing, is that there's a natural law and it's a law of human experience, just like the state of nature in John Locke or Thomas Hobbes. There's a focus also on individuals as the center of life, meaning that the primary focus for everything should be how the individual sort of is affected, is perceived, how the individual sort of makes decisions about their interests and their passions. The third is the emphasis on freedom. Like liberalism, classical liberalism, there's this strong emphasis on freedom. Contracts and the exchanges are the ways that economics understands the way that we relate to each other, that we develop agreements and that we get something and we give something. And that's known as contracts. If you go to law school in your first semester, you'll take a course on contracts. And contracts is the center of Anglican law, Anglo law, which is a type of law we practice here in the United States, with the exception of Louisiana, where the continental model of law is more emphasized, but not completely. Part of this idea of liberalism is that there's this natural marketplace of ideas, according to John Stuart Mill. Well, there's also this hidden hand of the market, according to Adam Smith, that essentially is like the self-government idea that we'll regulate ourselves. Well, Locke looked at that on the political side. Adam Smith looked at it on the economic side and said there's this natural order, this hidden hand, as he called it, of the market that is always going to be the best way of distributing the goods and services in a society. That doesn't mean it's always equal. As a matter of fact, there are often great winners and great losers. But the hidden hand of the market is what regulates it all, and it's a natural regulation that we shouldn't touch. Very similar to individuals are essentially born with inalienable rights, as Thomas Jefferson wrote. So intervention in the market needs to be avoided. Winners and losers happen. There's competition, and that's part of the natural order. I'm going to focus for a bit, so to get through this quickly, on 20th century thinkers, Friedrich Hayek first, and then John Maynard Keynes, and give you the basics of how their theory sort of spells out what they believe is necessary. Friedrich Hayek, an Austrian who was an economist, and he taught in Austria for many decades, was around to see the ill effects of the reparations forced upon the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the aftermath of World War I, and how it led to extreme poverty and extreme inflation and a great deal of economic and political instability. So in developing his theory, he basically said, look, what we got away from was the freedom that we all had when there wasn't some sort of government-imposed group of requirements, in this case, reparations. And so he felt that markets have a spontaneous order that needs not be disrupted and should not be disrupted. That, yes, the business cycle means there are going to be great economic booms and great economic busts. And looking back in our history, in the United States until the Great Depression, every 10 to 15 years, there was this enormous economic boom followed by a cycle of bust. And what Hayek argued was that that's the natural business cycle. A business succeeds, or a sector succeeds, and as a result, everybody copies it. There's enormous speculation. That speculation eventually creates what's called a bubble. That bubble sort of at some point can't sustain itself, and it collapses under its under its own weight, and that leads to a lot of people losing money, which then sort of leads to the next natural business cycle of somebody figuring out how to do something else in a way that works. And so for Hayek, this was all part of the natural order of the world as it relates to economics. That the people save money, that drives market investment, that creates growth. And so the main thing you have to do is make sure people can save as much money as they can so that they can then invest it, which means that you can't tax or spend very much. The more you tax a person, the less they have to spend, which means they're not going to invest, which means the market's not going to grow, which means that the economy is going to be in trouble. And so what he argues is that when government steps in by either taxing or spending, it creates all sorts of problems, including inflation. Inflation is the increase in the cost of a particular, or of goods and items beyond the past or from the past. And so when you talk about sort of increases in tuition, your tuition, that would be the inflation for college. I want you to know in 1978, 79, my freshman year in college, I went to a state university. The entire tuition for the whole year was $880. That is nowhere near the state tuition of the tuition of the same state institution. If it's now almost triple, even adjusting for inflation. But he argues in part that's because that market, the college market, is not naturally free. So for Hayek, failure is necessary. And there's a sort of another economic thinker, Schumpeter, who basically called this creative destruction. That what happens is, in the collapse of a market, when it busts, people will try to figure out what happens, but also try to figure out what the new opportunities are, and they will then sort of seek to create something new from the ashes. I'm currently doing this from an old restored mill that I live in, which is I have a loft apartment and a beautiful mill, and it's right on the river. It made fiberglass right before they closed. And it made textiles when it was first opened in 1868. That's an example of reuse or new ideas for old things, or using what Schumpeter called creative destruction. Hayek said that that's kind of what we have to accept. There are going to be winners and losers, and government role is not in the market. Government's job for Hayek is to provide the basic infrastructure, canals, roads, railroads, things like that, postal deliveries or communications, just to ensure that we can have a free market. That's what government's role is. Simply set the infrastructure into place. Hayek's legacy, and he died not all that long ago. He died not quite in your lifetime. I think he died in the 1970s. But Hayek's legacy is in what is called libertarian economics, and it's the one that dominates in the Republican Party today. Low taxes, very few government regulations, what's called hard money. That means that government actually tries to keep the value of its own currency high. And then government doesn't intervene. It doesn't regulate, it doesn't redistribute wealth, it doesn't take over sectors of the economy. Anything that should be done in the private sector gets done. So libertarian economics, which is also sometimes called freshwater economics, because the people who embrace it tend to be educated near the Great Lakes and teach near the Great Lakes, as opposed to saltwater economists, which I'll get to, who are on the coasts. These sort of libertarian economics people, freshwater economists, as I said, really believe government's role is minimal at best. One of the expressions that also applies to Hayek's legacy is this notion of supply-side economics, which was introduced during the Reagan administration, with the idea that if you cut taxes on people who have the most tax burden or the greatest tax burden, what will happen is they will take that money and invest it to try to make more money, which means more money will be put into the economy to invest in new economic endeavors, which will grow the economy. Everybody will benefit. And so you slash government spending, or at least you redirect it away from sort of putting direct dollars in the pockets of people, and instead you sort of give incentives for people to invest, and that's where you'll get economic growth. That's called supply side economics. It's a very simplistic version of it. Hayek's book that actually sort of lays out this whole theory of economic freedom is called The Road to Serfdom, and it's considered to be required reading for anybody who's interested in supply side or libertarian economics. I'm going to move now to John Maynard Keynes, who sort of was the winner in the 20th century after the Great Depression, all the way up through about 1980. And in his book, The General Theory of Economics, I believe it is, Keynes basically said, these classical liberal or classical economics, they got it wrong. That telling everybody government should not be involved is the wrong thing. They should actually be more involved when they need to be. And so for John Maynard Keynes, he said, look, balanced budgets for the government, you shouldn't worry about them when the economy is bad. When the economy is bad, that means the private sector is not investing in the economy, and they're not growing the economy on their own. And so you need an even bigger player, somebody who can influence the entire economic system, and that's government. And so actually deficit spending is a good thing, not a bad thing when times are tough. And so in your sort of young adulthood, you grew up during a period where the economy collapsed in 2008. And from 2008 up until now, government has been running much larger deficits. Well, that's because the people who are in charge in the Obama administration are Keynesians. They believe that actually government should spend more money during these times. The extent to which they agree with that is in question, but they generally believe that you need sort of budget deficits when things are tough and the private sector isn't working. So what they argue, the reason Keynes sort of believed that is, he said, look, when nobody's getting paid, when unemployment is high, when there's no growth in the economy, somebody's got to put money in the pockets of people who have to spend it today. And so there's, you have to increase what's called demand. And that's called demand side economics. That if you put money directly in the pockets of people who are going to spend it very quickly, they will spend it. And then the people they spend it, that they sort of give it to, will spend it as well. And then the people that they give it to will spend it as well. That's called the multiplier effect. That a dollar given to, for example, somebody on unemployment will actually go almost immediately into the economy. They'll go buy groceries. Well, that grocery store will take that money and hire new employees. And those new employees will then get paid, and then they will pay. And so the theory, and it's backed up by some empiricism, is that when you put $1 of government subsidy into a struggling economy, you get anywhere between $1.25 and $1.40 of impact. And so it's a good bang for the buck. So Keynes said, look, when times are strong, when growth is good, and the private sector is taking care of the economy, you don't need to have budget deficits. But when you have a bad economy, balanced budgets are not a good thing. They're a bad thing. They actually make it worse. So Keynes' legacy on sort of the U.S. is that it provided sort of fiscal policy as a key to affecting the microeconomy. Fiscal policy means the amount of money that's in supply that's controlled by a government. We use the Federal Reserve to do that. But it also means the amount of money that we tax people and spend. And so the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, created all sorts of government jobs, and to do it, they simply started sort of taking out debt. The Great Society programs also sort of said, hey, we can actually lift people out of poverty, give them more opportunity by increasing government spending to help them on things like education, job training, housing, and the like, and food, and medical coverage. The New Frontier, which was John Kennedy's administration, he was a Keynesian, but at that time, the economy was very, very strong on its own. And so Kennedy actually advocated and got implemented tax cuts and balanced budget, or close to balanced budgets. Generally speaking, the U.S. has not had a balanced budget since the 1920s, and it was only under Bill Clinton that we had surpluses. So the great enemy, in Keynes' view, is not inflation, the way Hayek saw it, but unemployment. And the reason unemployment is a problem is when people don't work, people don't spend, and when people don't spend, the economy doesn't grow. John Kenneth Galbraith was sort of the American version of John Maynard Keynes. He was a student of Keynes, and he became a very prominent economist. His son is now a prominent economist at Texas. Actually, I think he's at Harvard now. Paul Samuelson, who's a son, ironically became a neoclassicist. And then Paul Krugman, who writes for the New York Times and teaches at Princeton. These are Keynesians. What I want to do now is, John Maynard Keynes' views were very strong all the way up through the 1970s, but beginning in the 1970s, there was this period that we sort of had experience called stagflation, where the one enemy of the free marketeers, inflation, was high. And the other enemy of the Keynesians, unemployment, that was also high. And so people going, what's going on? And so there was an attempt to readjust both theories. And this is a theory of taking Keynes now and putting it into practice. And this is neoliberal economics, which is the one that essentially has won out. And it helps to explain why, when we look at the U.S. in the political compass test, we tend to be sort of in that blue quadrant because we believe government needs to get out of the market as much as they can. So neoliberal economics, which is what Klein takes on, is focused on globalization. And I apologize for the M there, I just saw it. It tends to be realist in its orientation, meaning, hey, we've got to sort of do what's in our best interest. And then it focuses on sort of what's called a market ideology. The ideology of the market, which Klein critiques, basically says, if free market is the most important thing, then what's happening is people aren't being served when it conflicts with the interests of those who benefit most from capitalism. Now, how does that become expressed in the world today? Well, most important, basically free trade. Free trade is the idea, again, of neoclassical economics that the best markets are the ones that are completely free. In order to do that, however, to have this sort of global economy where we're making money off of other countries and they're making money off of us and we're all getting what we want, we have to basically say the countries, in the past you used to control things like the taxes or the imposed on goods or the regulations that put conditions on whether goods can be sold in your country. We have to get rid of those. So no tariffs, low tariffs, no regulations, low regulations, laws and standards that interfere with any free flow of capital need to be sort of eliminated. And because, again, this natural force, free flow of capital, often called the electronic herd, means that investors have to be able to rush into a country and rush out without having to worry about individual standards that each country has regarding investing in their particular country. And so, again, this idea of a global economy requires global freedom, which then says, hey, wait a minute, countries need to knock down these standards, which means we have to have one set of rules, not 200 sets of rules for each country in the world. And so there tends to be this sort of focus on the free flow of capital, no regulations, low regulations, and whatever rules are established at a collective level, kind of like what we saw in Paris with climate change a couple of weeks ago. But also in terms of the World Bank and its standards for loaning money, or the World Trade Organization in terms of whether you can put tariffs on things or protect economic sectors of your economy. But it's also sort of demanding that in order for a company, a private investor to go into a country, that their government spending has to be low. And so privatization of services, meaning things that government used to do, you actually sell off and let the private sector do, and that you constrain your fiscal policy to make sure you have balanced budgets. That's kind of what neoliberal economics is. Low tariffs, no regulations, free flow of capital, free flow of goods, private, and reducing the size and extent of government in the economy. So neoliberal economics is essentially a return to neoclassicism. That's why it's called neo. Neoliberal, liberal, small l means, freedom. So return to. So examples that we see in the United States, Paul Krugman, he basically says government is a necessary and positive force. And Krugman argues that the United States economy, as sort of mediocre as it's been, is a whole lot better than the rest of the world because of the Obama administration's economic stimulus of 2009, and he compares that to places like Great Britain and Japan and a number of other countries where their response was, oh, we have to balance our budget, we have to cut services, and their economies continue to lag behind ours as a result. Well, Keynesian economists like Krugman sort of see that deficit spending is necessary. The Obama stimulus, Krugman argues, wasn't enough. That's why our economy is not even stronger. Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, who's the leader of the Republicans in Congress, also he chaired the Budget Committee. He has sort of the Hayek sort of strain, the neoclassical strain. No, 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 no. The problem is government's grown too big, that largesse will then sort of lead to inefficiency in the market, and that we have to cut the budget as much as possible and balance it and lower taxes, not raise them, so that the economy can work on its own. So there are political ramifications. For Hayek, the idea of collectivism in terms of the role of government in the economy is evil, it's bad, it's disruptive. Keynes, on the other hand, believes collectivism prevents these major fluctuations, these booms and busts in the macroeconomy, and then also fills in the void when the private sector collapses and can't support the economy. And so the political ramifications are pretty clear, I hope, that followers of Hayek or neoliberal economics believe that government needs to get out, that market needs to be free. That tends to be the position of Republicans in the United States, at least. And John Maynard Keynes, the Keynesians, they believe collectivism actually is an important sort of positive force That's modern liberalism, which I'll talk about in the next segment a little bit. But again, that's generally a position held by Democrats. And so when you hear Democrats and Republicans arguing, essentially what they're doing is they're arguing the basis of the Keynes-Hayek debate. Very important to remember. I'm going to just sort of go through this very quickly. It's a matter of degree. Not all Republicans believe markets should be completely free. Not all Democrats believe markets should be intervened constantly. There is this middle ground, and it's part of that spatial model. Socialists are way out on the left. Market fundamentalists are way out on the right. But again, the rest of us are somewhere in between. So what do we have here in the United States? The answer is a little bit of both. Keynes and Hayek, I'm not going to get into Friedman. I was going to, but I'm running way over. I'm into 26 minutes almost. I'll try to get through. But Keynes and Hayek, you can see in our economy. Keynes, in the sense that we are doing deficit spending, and we're doing less of it now that the economy is improving. But even sort of in the area of defense spending, when you take discretionary spending, half of what we spend, more than half actually, is on the Defense Department and war. That if you take everything spent on everything else outside of what are so-called entitlements, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and a couple of other smaller ones, about 60% of all money is spent on either purchasing weapons, training and deploying troops, managing those troops, and executing military conflict and war. So we see sort of that government intervention in the market by priming the economy to keep private sector defense contractors sort of healthy, wealthy, and wise. That's a little Keynesianism as well. We see Hayek in the call for free trade, for low taxes, and for balanced budgets. So takeaway, remember, ideological extremes require absolute adherence to a free market or a completely egalitarian market. For those who are more ideological, they don't want any kind of compromise. They see that as being awful. As a result, liberalism as a philosophy is actually in conflict with both the extreme right and the extreme left. Liberals tend to be in the middle. And I'm going to skip that question. Now, as you read Klein, you need to think about sort of how this affects Klein. This is why I did this relatively long presentation. Klein argues that capitalism and climate change are on a collision course, and that capitalism requires neoliberal economics, and that neoliberal economics requires what she calls extractivism. That extractivism then leads to conflict with the local sovereignty interests of people who don't want their resources exploited, or don't believe that we should continue to pull out fossil fuel, whatever it is. We basically, that capitalism has an inherent tension with the collective interest of local people, or indigenous people, as she calls them. So in neoliberal economics, markets are seen as stronger than government. That's where markets trump state sovereignty. That neoliberalism requires that governments conform to some sort of worldwide standard. And so she sees that as a threat to democracy. Globalization sort of is often seen as sort of a cover for neoliberal economic ideology. A lot of critics of globalization basically say, yeah, we're globalizing so that those who own all the interests, all the power, or the private elites and the economic elites, they basically force government to be on their side because it makes them richer and us poorer. And neoliberal economics is sort of the ideology that drives all of that. But what she doesn't say that I want you to think about as you're reading it is think about sort of the other implication of her title, Capitalism versus Climate. And that is, environmentalism itself is also often seen as an ideology And it's possible that sort of what she's really sort of illustrating is this clash between the two collectivist ideologies, one for free markets, the other to protect the environment. We're going to, again, address that issue in greater detail. I think I've spent enough time and I hit 30 minutes, so goodbye.